Why was no one listening to her? The briefing room was alive with sound, but it was the wrong kind of sound. Too many voices, each layered on top of the other. Too much certainty, delivered with bravado, drowning out everything else. The air smelled faintly of burnt coffee, dust, and the iron tang of the building's old pipes. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, making even silence hard to find. She sat at the long metal table, uniform neat, hair tied back, posture straight. Her name was Captain Leena Varus, but here she was simply Varus, reduced to syllables that carried no warmth, no recognition of the years she had given to earn that seat at the table. Her eyes were fixed on the glowing satellite image projected on the wall. A valley, rugged, unforgiving terrain, jagged cliffs cutting shadows across the land. The kind of place that could swallow a person whole without leaving a trace. The kind of place she had been to before. She didn't speak. The colonel leaned forward, his finger stabbing at the map. We move in at dawn. Units Alpha and Bravo sweep east and west. Delta covers the ridge. Charlie takes point. His voice filled the room with a rhythm of command, each word sharp and certain. Someone coughed. A chair scraped. Another officer raised a hand to ask about supply lines. Another cut him off to argue about entry points. Plans overlapped, bouncing around like ricochets. And still she didn't speak. Her silence wasn't absence. It wasn't weakness. It was calculation. Because Leena already knew what they were walking into. Not from the map, not from intelligence reports, but from something deeper. The memory of another valley, years ago, where shadows hid rifles and silence was the loudest warning of all. Her fingers pressed together under the table, hiding the slight tremor. She remembered the sound of rain on tin rooftops, the sting of smoke in her lungs, the look in a friend's eyes as blood pooled where words should have been. But she didn't tell them that. The colonel slammed his hand down, silencing the chatter. That's the plan. No delays, no second guessing. We move in at first light. Chairs scraped back, papers gathered, boots shuffled against concrete. The room emptied with the kind of restless energy soldiers carry when they think the hardest part is over, the waiting. She stayed seated. For a moment she stared at the screen, at the valley frozen in shades of gray. Her pulse thudded in her ears. She wanted to say something, to ask the question no one else was asking. Why was the valley so quiet, too quiet? But she didn't. Not yet. She stood, boots clicking softly as she followed the others out. Her silence went unnoticed, but it carried weight. Because silence, when chosen, is not absence. It is its own kind of power. And what they didn't know was that she had already heard the valley speak. It was just in a language only silence understands. That night the barracks hummed with small sounds, not the chaos of battle but the quieter chaos of preparation. Zippers drawn, straps tightened, weapons checked and rechecked. The metallic snap of magazines, the creak of bunks, the muffled laughter of soldiers trying to pretend they weren't afraid. Leena sat on the edge of her cot, her rifle laid across her knees. She polished the scope with a soft cloth, not because it needed it, but because the ritual steadied her hands. Slow, precise. Each circle of the cloth was a way of pushing back the tremor in her chest. Across the room, Corporal Diaz hunched over a notebook. He wrote quickly, pausing often, chewing the end of his pen as though the words refused to come out clean. His lips moved, silent rehearsals of sentences he wasn't sure he'd ever deliver. When he noticed her watching, he shut the notebook quickly. His eyes dropped to the floor. She didn't press him, she knew that look. Letters written in war were half dream, half prayer. Sometimes they reached home, sometimes they didn't. Near the lockers, Private Harlow sat cross-legged, shuffling a deck of cards. His hands moved nervously, turning the deck over and over, pretending it was a game, pretending his fingers weren't shaking. He was 19. Barely old enough to shave. The cards were his anchor, his small rebellion against the fear pressing in. By the door, Staff Sergeant Mason leaned against the frame, arms crossed, jaw tight. He chewed gum like it was the only thing keeping his anger from spilling out. His eyes looked hollow, like a man who had already buried too many brothers. He didn't talk much, but the silence around him wasn't the same as hers. His was heavy, resigned. Leena studied them, her people not perfect, not ready, but hers. She thought about telling them what she felt, about the silence of valleys like the one on the map, about the way air itself could betray you, carrying whispers of rifles hidden in shadows. But she didn't, not tonight. Instead, she asked Mason quietly, "You think Diaz will ever finish that letter?" Mason's jaw worked. He spat the gum into a paper cup. "Depends if he's writing it for someone alive or dead." The words landed like a knife against stone. The room grew still. Diaz looked away. Harlow shuffled faster. Leena lowered her eyes, returning to her scope. The cloth moved in circles, slow, silent. Dawn arrived pale and brittle. The horizon split with light that carried no warmth, only the promise of exposure. The helicopter rotors beat the air into thunder. Dust and grit stung their eyes, whipped into their mouths. Inside the chopper, no one spoke. Their helmets pressed tight. Their bodies swayed with the turbulence. Words would have been useless anyway, drowned out by the roar of the blades. Leena closed her eyes. For a moment the noise fell away, replaced by another sound. Rain, years ago. A night raid that collapsed in silence and fire. The last breaths of someone she couldn't save. The absence of words when they mattered most. She opened her eyes. This was not that night, this was now. The valley stretched below them. Rugged cliffs, shattered rock, a scar in the earth. It looked lifeless, but lifelessness in war was often a disguise. Boots hit dirt. The ground was cold, brittle underfoot. The air was thin, sharp in the lungs. The colonel's orders unfolded with crisp precision. Units spread, weapons raised, radios crackling with clipped affirmations. Every movement carried the illusion of control. But Leena paused, tilted her head, listened. The valley was too still, too complete in its silence. No insects, no birds, not even the wind threading through the rocks. Her stomach tightened. She wanted to break her silence, to warn them, to say what she felt pressing against her ribs. But what if she was wrong? What if the silence was just silence? What if she spoke and no one listened anyway? The thought froze her tongue. The first shot shattered the world. It tore through the dawn with the violence of thunder. Private Harlow dropped instantly, his body folding like the deck of cards that spilled from his vest, scattering across the dirt. The jokers fluttered against stone like mocking laughter. Chaos erupted. Shouts, commands, gunfire ricocheting across the valley walls. Dust rose in clouds, choking vision, clogging lungs. Leena hit the ground, pulling Diaz down with her. His notebook fell free, pages tearing, words scattering into the dirt as if trying to escape what had come. Her pulse hammered in her ears. She wanted to scream, "I knew it, I heard the silence. Why didn't I say it?" But there was no time for regret. Only action. Her rifle was already up, scope glinting. She steadied her breath, found the shadow of movement in the rocks above, and squeezed. One shot, clean, silent. The figure collapsed, the ambush stuttered. Her silence had spoken for her. But only she knew how much it had cost. That night, under the fragile glow of a small fire, they sat in silence. They counted their dead, one less voice among them, one less face. No one blamed her, no one mentioned the briefing. They just sat, each locked in their own silence. Diaz staring at his torn notebook, Mason chewing on nothing, his jaw clenching against words unsaid. Leena stared into the flames, her face blank, her thoughts screaming. Because this was only the beginning. And there was something she still hadn't told them. Not yet. How do you measure silence? By its length or by what it takes from you? The fire had burned low, its embers glowing faintly, casting weak halos on weary faces. The night was still, too still. Soldiers shifted in their places, restless in their grief. One death was already too many, and the mission had barely begun. Leena sat apart, her back against a jagged boulder, the faint warmth of the fire on her boots but not her skin. Her rifle rested across her knees, her hand loosely wrapped around the grip. She wasn't cleaning it now, not checking, not adjusting, just holding it like something alive. She thought of Harlow, the boy with the deck of cards. She could still see his hand, mid-shuffle, the way the king of spades had been stuck to his thumb. She wondered if he had believed he'd live long enough to lose a hand of poker again. The silence pressed against her chest. She hated this part. The quiet after the chaos, when the echoes of gunfire were gone, but the emptiness left behind was louder than bullets. Diaz shifted closer, his notebook clutched against him, torn pages sticking out like broken wings. "Captain," he whispered, "you think it's over?" She didn't answer. He mistook her silence for dismissal and leaned back, hugging the notebook tighter. It wasn't dismissal, it was calculation. The valley had spoken once, it would speak again. And she was listening. By morning their fire had burned to ash. They moved in silence, breaking camp quickly, each man and woman folding their grief into the mechanical rhythm of routine. Straps tightened, weapons slung, helmets adjusted. The colonel barked orders, voice hoarse from smoke and fatigue. His tone carried the brittle edge of someone forcing control back into his grasp. "Alpha, sweep the ridge. Bravo, cover. Charlie, advance." His eyes scanned the faces, pausing for a moment on the empty space where Harlow should have been. His jaw tightened. "We don't stop until the valley's cleared." No one spoke. Leena adjusted her pack, feeling the familiar weight press against her shoulders. She followed the others into the narrowing gorge, the cliffs towering above like silent judges. The silence grew heavier with each step. It wasn't just the lack of sound, it was the presence of it, a silence so deliberate it felt engineered, as though the valley itself was waiting. She watched Mason ahead of her, his steps steady, his shoulders squared. He didn't look back, didn't falter, but she could see the set of his jaw, the muscle twitching there. He was afraid, he just wouldn't admit it. Behind her, Diaz muttered under his breath, words she couldn't quite catch. Prayers, maybe, or fragments of the letter he couldn't finish. The path narrowed further, forcing them into single file. The cliffs rose higher, their shadows slicing across the ground. Leena slowed, her ears strained. Nothing. And that was the problem. She wanted to stop, to speak, to say, "Wait, listen, don't you hear it?" But her throat locked. Because what if they didn't hear what she did? What if silence was just silence to them? The explosion ripped through the ground. A flash, a roar. The earth buckled beneath their boots, throwing bodies against rock, choking the air with dust and fire. Leena hit the ground hard, her shoulders slamming against stone. Pain shot down her arm, white-hot, blinding for a moment. Screams, shouts, a voice crying out for help, then cut short. She blinked through the haze, saw Diaz on the ground, blood streaking his cheek, his notebook torn from his grasp again, fluttering uselessly in the blast wind. Mason's voice cut through the chaos. "Ambush, take cover." Gunfire erupted from the cliffs. Shadows moved above, muzzle flashes flaring like lightning in the stone. Bullets rained down, sparking against rock, chewing dirt into clouds. Leena dragged herself behind an outcropping, pulling Diaz with her. He groaned, clutching his side, his eyes wide with panic. She pressed her hand to his wound. Blood seeped hot against her palm. "You're fine," she lied softly. "You're okay, stay with me." Her rifle lay just out of reach, its strap twisted. She lunged, dragging it to her, sliding the bolt back with practiced hands. The valley roared with sound now. Gunfire, shouts, explosions, but beneath it all she still felt the silence, waiting, watching. Her scope found movement, a figure ducking behind a boulder above. She fired, the body dropped. Another she adjusted, breath squeezed, another fell. Her silence spoke in bullets, precise and unforgiving. The fight stretched into eternity, minutes disguised as hours. Dust coated their tongues, sweat stung their eyes, hands blistered against metal. When it ended, silence returned, heavier than before. Bodies lay broken on both sides. The valley smelled of cordite and blood, the metallic tang thick in the air. Leena sat against a rock, her rifle limp in her hands. Her arm ached from the fall, blood seeping slowly through her sleeve. Diaz leaned beside her, pale, trembling, his notebook gone. His voice cracked. "Why didn't we see it? Why didn't we know?" She closed her eyes. Because she had known. She just hadn't spoken. Not soon enough. They buried their dead at the base of the cliffs. The soil was thin, rocky, refusing to yield easily. Each shovel strike felt like punishment, a rhythm of grief and exhaustion. Mason said nothing, his face set in stone. Diaz tried to whisper words, prayers maybe, but they faltered, unfinished. Leena placed a single card, the king of spades, on the mound of stones above Harlow's grave. No one asked why. They just accepted the gesture in silence. That night they camped in the valley's shadow, their fire dim, their bodies curled against the cold. Leena sat awake, staring at the cliffs, listening, always listening. And for the first time, she allowed herself to remember. Not just Harlow, not just Diaz's trembling hands, but the past. Another mission, another valley, years ago. Her unit had walked into silence then, too. They hadn't listened. And she hadn't spoken. She remembered the faces of the ones who hadn't come back, remembered the weight of their silence as she carried it home. That was the secret she hadn't told them. That was the burden she carried alone. Morning came gray, cold, unfeeling. The colonel's voice rasped with exhaustion as he gathered them. "We press forward. The objective is still ahead. We finish this." No one cheered. No one protested. They just moved. Leena adjusted her pack, her rifle heavy across her shoulder. Her body ached. Her silence weighed more than her gear. But she kept walking. Because she knew something now. This valley wouldn't just take their bodies. It would take their voices too. Unless she learned to speak. And soon. What does silence demand from you? For some it was patience, for others fear. For Captain Leena Varus, silence demanded sacrifice. The valley stretched ahead, narrowing into a jagged throat of stone. The cliffs rose higher, their shadows cutting the light into slivers. The team moved slowly, weapons raised, boots crunching against loose gravel. Each step felt heavier than the last. The colonel's voice came clipped through the radio. "Stay sharp, they're watching." Of course they were. Leena felt it, the same way she had felt it years ago in another place that had stolen voices and lives. It wasn't paranoia. It was instinct. And instinct, she had learned, was often carved from wounds that never fully healed. She glanced at Diaz. He walked stiffly, his hand pressed against his side where the blast had grazed him. His notebook was gone now, lost in the chaos. His eyes looked hollow without it, as though he had lost not just paper but a tether. Mason walked ahead, his rifle steady, his head scanning the cliffs. His silence was harder than hers, heavier. A silence forged from survival, from burying too many names. Leena's silence was different. Hers carried guilt. They reached a plateau by noon, a rare flat stretch of earth amid the stone. The colonel called a halt, signaling for a defensive circle. Soldiers dropped their packs, water bottles unscrewed, breaths heavy. The sun pressed down with relentless weight, baking sweat into fabric. The smell of dust and gun oil thickened the air. Leena crouched near the edge, scanning the horizon through her scope. The rocks shimmered in the heat, distorting distance, making movement seem like mirages. but she knew the difference between tricks of the light and the patience of an enemy. She lowered the scope, waited, listened. Nothing, which meant something. Behind her, Diaz muttered again, not prayers this time, words spilling under his breath, fragments of his unfinished letter. I don't know if you'll read this, maybe it won't matter. Mason cut him off sharply, save your breath. Diaz looked up, startled, his face flushed, shame mixing with fear. Leena turned her head, her eyes locked on Mason's. She didn't speak, she didn't need to. Her silence reminded him. Diaz needed something, even if it was just words to himself. Mason looked away. The colonel studied the map, his voice low but firm. Objectives less than 2 clicks ahead. Intelligence says high-value target inside the compound. We move at dusk. Leena's gaze returned to the valley. A compound. A target. Words that meant nothing to the dead they had already buried. Her hand brushed against her rifle, the familiar metal grounding her. She wanted to argue, to question, to ask what wasn't on the map. But she stayed silent. Not yet. As dusk bled into the sky, they moved. The compound emerged from the stone like a scar. Low walls, corrugated roofs, a scattering of antennas jutting like bones. No movement, no smoke, no sound. Too quiet. Her stomach tightened. The colonel signaled. Units spread, circling, converging. Boots pressed against dirt, rifles angled, breaths held. Leena advanced with Mason and Diaz, hugging the wall, her finger brushing the trigger guard. The compound silence pressed in, suffocating. She caught Diaz's eye. He swallowed hard, his lips moving again. She wanted to tell him, don't waste your breath on prayers, save it for silence. But before she could, the colonel's voice cut through. Breach. The charge exploded, the door flew inward, shadows swallowed them whole. Inside, the compound was empty. Rooms stripped bare, mattresses overturned, dust thick on the floor, no weapons, no supplies. No enemy. Just silence. The colonel's face darkened, his voice rose. We've been fed bad intel. Mason muttered, low but sharp, or worse. Leena moved slowly through the room, her boots crunching against scattered debris. Her light swept across walls scrawled with faded writing, names carved into plaster, graffiti layered over graffiti. One word repeated in several places, a word she recognized, though the paint was smeared. Wait. Her breath caught. The valley wasn't empty. It was waiting. They didn't rest that night, couldn't. The compound offered no safety, only questions. Soldiers whispered among themselves, nerves stretched thin. Diaz sat in the corner, his back against the wall, staring at his empty hands where his notebook used to be. Mason stood guard, silent, chewing on invisible gum, his eyes scanning shadows that didn't move. Leena sat apart as always. Her silence grew heavier. Because this wasn't just bad intel. This was something worse. Someone knew they were coming. Someone had planned for their arrival. And she remembered. Years ago the same. A mission promised as clean, simple, intelligence that led them into silence. Silence that exploded into chaos. She hadn't spoken then, and men had died. Now again. She pressed her palms together, hiding the tremor in her fingers. How many silences could she survive? Near midnight, Diaz's voice broke the stillness. Captain, his whisper was small, hesitant. She didn't look at him. What if, he paused, swallowed, what if we're not supposed to come back? The words cut deeper than gunfire. She turned her head slowly. His face was pale, his eyes wide and glassy. Mason snapped from across the room. Shut it, Diaz, don't talk like that. But Diaz didn't stop. His words tumbled, fragile, desperate. What if that's why it's so quiet? What if this isn't about us winning, but about us being buried here? Silence followed. Heavy, suffocating. Leena didn't answer. because a part of her wondered if he was right. At dawn, the colonel gave orders. His voice was hoarse, stripped of patience. "We're pulling back. Regroup with command. We can't hold here." Relief flickered across tired faces. Retreat meant survival. But Leena's chest tightened, because silence doesn't release you easily. And she knew the valley wasn't done with them yet. They moved at first light, packs heavy, steps dragging. The cliffs loomed, casting long shadows that stretched like claws across their path. Leena's every nerve strained. The silence was too complete, again. She slowed, tilted her head. A sound broke the stillness. Not loud, not sharp. Just a click. Metal against stone. Her eyes snapped upward. The shot came a breath later. A soldier fell, then another. Chaos erupted, shouts, gunfire. The valley came alive with death again. Leena dove behind cover, her heart hammering. She had heard it. She had known. And still, she hadn't spoken fast enough. Her rifle rose. She fired 1, 2, 3. Each shot an answer, each shot a voice for her silence. But still, the valley spoke louder. By the time the echoes faded, they had lost more. The colonel stood, his face gray with fury and grief. His voice broke as he gave the only order left. "We hold, we dig in, we survive." No one cheered, no one replied. They just obeyed. Leena lowered herself against the rocks, her chest heaving, her hands trembling. Her silence pressed harder than ever. Because she knew something they didn't. This wasn't a failed mission. This was a trap. And she had walked them into it. Again. What does a soldier do when silence betrays them? For most, they break. For Captain Leena Varus, breaking was never an option, not anymore. The valley was no longer a landscape. It was a cage. The cliffs rose like walls, the shadows like bars. Every echo of gunfire hung in the air too long, fading only to remind them how few voices remained. The colonel's face looked older, carved by lines of fury and exhaustion. He crouched by the makeshift cover, hands trembling as he marked a rough sketch in the dirt. "We dig here, line of fire on both ridges, sandbags from packs, ammo rationed. We don't move until command sends extraction." The men listened, but their eyes said what their mouths did not. Extraction rarely came for those swallowed by silence. Leena leaned her rifle against the rock, sliding down until the stone pressed cold against her spine. Her breath came shallow, her throat dry. She scanned the cliffs again, her scope tracing ridges, waiting for movement that never appeared. The valley knew patience. And patience was deadlier than bullets. Diaz sat nearby, his bandage dark with blood, his fingers twitching restlessly. He no longer muttered prayers. His silence was different now, hollow, defeated. Mason crouched across from him, eyes fixed on the horizon, jaw clenched so tightly that the muscle ticked. His silence was harder, steel over glass, threatening to shatter. Leena watched them both, then closed her eyes. Inside, her own silence roared. Because she had known. She had felt it, seen it, carried the weight of it in every scar, and yet she hadn't spoken soon enough. Now soldiers were gone, voices cut from the earth. Because of silence. Because of her. The first day passed in uneasy stillness. They dug shallow trenches, stacked rocks into cover, rationed water in sips. Every so often, a shot cracked from the cliffs, forcing heads down, pinning them like insects under glass. Each bullet was not meant to kill, but to remind them, you are watched. By nightfall, they had stopped talking. Not by choice. By fear. Every word seemed dangerous, something the valley could hear, something that could draw fire. So they sat in silence, staring into shadows, waiting. Leena didn't sleep. She couldn't. At dawn, the colonel tried the radio again. Static, nothing more. His curses were low, bitter, meant for no ears but his own. Cut off, Mason muttered. Leena looked up sharply. His voice was like gravel. He wasn't wrong. Cut off, abandoned. The colonel's glare silenced him. But Mason's words lingered. Diaz pressed a hand against his temple, eyes wide. We're not getting out. Leena wanted to tell him to stop, to steady his voice, to breathe. But the words stayed behind her lips. Because she didn't believe them either. Midday heat burned the valley. Sweat-stung eyes, soaked uniforms turned the air into weight. The soldiers shifted restlessly, their nerves fraying. That was when the whispers began. Not from the men. From the cliffs. Faint voices carried on the wind, words in a language most didn't understand, but the tone was unmistakable. Mocking, calling. Mason's grip tightened on his rifle. They're toying with us. The colonel spat into the dirt. Ignore it. But ignoring didn't erase it. The voices grew louder, sometimes laughter, sometimes silence, always close yet never visible. A reminder, the valley didn't just kill, it waited until you begged for death. Night fell again. Leena sat awake, her back against the trench wall, staring into darkness. The stars above looked sharp enough to cut. Diaz stirred, his voice low. Captain. She turned. His eyes reflected starlight, wide and hollow. Why aren't you afraid? He whispered. Her throat tightened. She wanted to tell him she was afraid. That fear lived in her bones, in her silence, in every memory of every mission where men hadn't come back. But fear was private. Instead, she answered with the only truth she could offer. Because I don't have time to be. Diaz blinked. He didn't understand. Or maybe he did, and that was worse. He lay back down. And silence took him. By the third day, thirst gnawed at them. Water skins were nearly dry. The colonel rationed what little remained, his eyes bloodshot, his voice breaking with each command. Hold out, command will send someone. No one believed him anymore. Mason muttered under his breath, curses sharp, venomous. His silence had cracked into fragments of anger. Leena watched the colonel's hands shake as he passed her the canteen. He was unraveling. They all were. Except her. Her silence was intact. But only because she had learned to let it break her long ago. The next attack came at dusk. Shadows moved along the ridges, faint, swift, deliberate. Gunfire erupted, spraying down into the trenches. Dirt exploded. Bullets chewed stone. Men screamed. Leena pressed her body flat, returning fire in short bursts, controlled, precise. Her shots cracked against the cliffs, but the enemy melted back into stone, invisible again. When silence returned, 3 more soldiers lay still. The colonel's voice rasped, "Count ammo." Mason's reply was raw, furious, too low. Diaz sobbed quietly, his bloodied hand shaking as he reloaded. Leena stayed silent. Her chest heaved, sweat stung her eyes, her ears rang. And she knew. The valley wasn't trying to wipe them out in a rush. It was bleeding them dry. By the 4th night, even silence became unbearable. The men whispered to themselves, muttering fragments of home, of family, of promises never to be kept. Their voices sounded foreign, broken, as though silence had changed their language. Mason snapped at one soldier for speaking too loud. The colonel snapped at Mason for snapping. Tension coiled, tighter and tighter, until even breathing felt dangerous. Leena sat apart, her rifle across her lap, her eyes hollow. She didn't speak. Not because she had nothing to say. Because silence was the only thing she could still control. At dawn, Diaz reached his breaking point. He stood abruptly, staggering into the open, shouting at the cliffs. "Stop hiding, stop watching us, come down and fight." His voice cracked, raw, echoing against stone. Leena's heart lurched. No. The shot dropped him instantly. He fell without a sound. Silence reclaimed him. Mason cursed, slamming his fist into the dirt, teeth bared. The colonel's face collapsed into his hands. Leena froze. Her throat closed, her chest burned. Her silence screamed inside her, louder than any gunfire. Because Diaz's death wasn't the valley's fault. It was hers. She could have stopped him, could have spoken, could have said something. But she hadn't. And now his silence would last forever. By nightfall, only a handful of them remained. The colonel, worn to bone and despair. Mason, his fury cracking him from within. 2 young soldiers who had stopped speaking altogether. And Leena. Always Leena. The valley had taken their words, their hope, their breath. But not hers. Not yet. She sat in the dark, her hands trembling around her rifle, her silence heavier than ever. Because she understood something now. This wasn't just a mission gone wrong. This wasn't just an ambush. This was punishment. And silence was the executioner. How much can silence take before it starts to eat the living? The 4th night bled into the 5th day without mercy. Dawn spilled across the valley, pale and cold, as if the sun itself pitied them but refused to help. The bodies of their brothers-in-arms lay where they had fallen, wrapped in tarps too thin to block out the truth. No one had the strength to bury them anymore. The colonel sat slumped against a rock, eyes hollow, skin gray. His hand shook as he tried to scribble notes on a weathered pad, his pen carving frantic lines into the paper. His words were nonsense. Leena saw it in the way his lips moved without sound, in the desperate flick of his eyes that darted to the cliffs, then down, then back again. The valley wasn't killing him with bullets, it was killing him with waiting. Mason paced, back and forth like a wolf in a cage too small. His boots crunched against gravel, his breaths came fast, harsh. His silence wasn't silence anymore. It was noise, unspoken rage that burned louder than any scream. Leena hadn't moved in hours. Her rifle lay balanced across her knees, her hands folded over it. She watched the cliffs, every shadow, every ripple of heat, waiting for something to move. Her body was stone. Her eyes were fire. Because in her head, Diaz's voice still echoed, his last shout, his fall. And the silence after. Her silence. By midday, the heat suffocated them. Water gone, food dwindling, lips cracked, voices rasped. The 2 young soldiers had retreated inward, sitting close together, whispering nonsense stories about home, about rivers, about bread, about women they'd kissed only once. They whispered not to each other but to themselves, as if their words could keep them from disappearing. The colonel coughed hard, his chest rattling, his strength gone. Mason snapped. Enough, his voice tore through the dry air. We stay here, we die, sitting ducks, starving rats. The young soldiers flinched. The colonel raised his head slowly, eyes sunken. We hold position, command will. Command won't do a damn thing, Mason exploded, his fist slamming into the trench wall, dust rising with the impact. His voice cracked under fury and despair. They left us, don't you see? We're dead men, dead already. Leena's fingers tightened around her rifle. The colonel tried to speak again, but Mason turned on him, spitting venom. You're clinging to rules, orders, protocol. Out here, none of that matters. Out here, it's survival, and survival means moving. His eyes shifted, locking on Leena. Her heart froze. You feel it too, don't you, Captain? Mason's words were sharp, accusing, laced with madness. You sit there like stone, watching us rot. What are you waiting for? Permission? Or the moment we're all too weak to stop you from walking out alone? The colonel tried to rise, voice hoarse. Mason. But Mason's glare burned hotter. No, I've seen it, the silence around her. She knew this would happen, she knew. The words cut. Because he wasn't entirely wrong. Leena's silence had always been her weapon, her armor, her way of carrying truths no one wanted spoken. But now her silence was firewood. Mason was striking the match. She wanted to deny him, to tell him he was wrong, to say she had never betrayed them, never held back anything that would have saved them. But in her chest, the truth weighed too heavy. There were things she hadn't told them, about her past, about her scars, about the mission before this one, the one that had led her here to this valley with these men who were dying one by one. She opened her mouth and closed it again. Mason's lips twisted. See, she won't even speak. The colonel's voice cracked through the tension. Enough, she's not the enemy, they are. His trembling finger pointed to the cliffs. Don't you dare tear this unit apart while the valley watches. But the damage was done. Silence pressed down heavier than gunfire. That night no one slept. The colonel wheezed softly, his breath rattling like broken glass. The young soldiers clutched their rifles as if steel could replace courage. Mason sat apart, his shadow carved against the dirt wall, his eyes burning in the dark. And Leena, she stayed awake, her silence louder than ever. Because Mason's words wouldn't leave her. She knew. Yes, she knew. Not about the ambush, not exactly, but about what silence does, how it strips men bare, how it bends them until they break. Because she had lived it before. And she had never told them. It was the 6th dawn when the valley struck again. The attack was sudden, brutal. Shadows slid across the ridges, gunfire rained down. The young soldiers screamed, firing blindly into stone. Bullets cracked, ricocheted. Dust filled the air. Leena's scope caught flashes, movement, muzzle flares. She fired, calm, deliberate, precise. Each pull of the trigger was ice against fire. But there were too many. The young soldiers fell, both of them, their whispers silenced mid-breath. The colonel crawled for cover, coughing blood, clutching at his chest as bullets tore through the dirt around him. Mason roared, unleashing rounds until his rifle clicked dry, his fury spilling louder than the storm of bullets. Then silence again. The kind that doesn't feel empty, but heavy, like a weight pressing down on the chest of every survivor. Now there were 3. Just 3. The colonel barely alive, Mason burning with rage, and Leena drowning in silence. Afterward, Mason sat in the dirt, blood streaking his face, laughter spilling from his throat. Not joy, not relief, madness. 3 left, he muttered, 3 little ghosts in a graveyard. The colonel tried to sit upright, his hand clutching his side. His voice came weak, rasping. We hold position. Mason barked a bitter laugh. Position? What position? They're bleeding us out. One by one, that's not war, that's slaughter. His eyes found Leena again. You know what this is, don't you? You've seen it before. That's why you don't talk. You're just waiting for the silence to bury us. Leena's throat tightened. Her silence was cracking. Mason leaned closer, voice low, poisoned. Tell me I'm wrong. Tell me you don't already know how this ends. Her lips parted, but the words stayed trapped in her chest, tangled in fear, guilt, memory. And Mason smiled, a broken, bitter smile. Silence, he whispered, always silence. That night Leena dreamt. Not of the valley, but of the mission before. The outpost, the ambush, the silence that swallowed her entire team while she crouched behind stone, her rifle pressed to her chest, her mouth shut tight as screams cut the air. She had survived by staying silent, by not moving, by not calling out. And when the silence fell again, she was the only one left. That was the night she learned, silence is survival. But survival comes with a cost. She woke with tears on her face, hidden in the dark. Because Mason was right. She had seen this before. And she had never spoken of it. By morning, the colonel could no longer stand. He lay pale, breath shallow, whispering names of men long gone. His orders were fragments now, pieces of protocol that no longer mattered. Mason sat nearby, his rifle across his lap, eyes hollow, rage burned down to embers. And Leena stood, scanning the cliffs, her silence heavier than ever. Because she knew something neither of them wanted to face. This valley wasn't just a battlefield. It was a mirror. And silence wasn't absence. It was courage. But courage demanded sacrifice. The kind she hadn't made yet. What happens when silence becomes louder than screams? The valley had grown too still. Even the wind had stopped moving. No birds, no whispers from the ridges, just an oppressive, suffocating quiet that pressed into every pore of their skin. Leena sat with her rifle across her lap, her eyes tracing the cliff edges like clockwork. Back and forth, back and forth. Every rock felt like a threat. Every shadow looked alive. She blinked less now, afraid she'd miss the one movement that would end them. Mason was different. His packing had stopped days ago. Now he crouched low, a coil of fury wound tight, his eyes darting not just at the cliffs, but at her. And the colonel, he lay against the wall of the trench, too weak to lift his head, lips dry and cracked. His voice had dwindled into whispers, sometimes orders, sometimes names, sometimes apologies. It was just them now. 3 souls left in the valley of silence. At noon, Mason finally broke it. "We can't stay here." His words were sharp, cutting through the air like a blade. The colonel stirred, his chest rattling with effort. "We hold position." Mason snapped his head toward him, eyes blazing. "Position? What position, sir? This trench is a coffin. We wait here, we're buried alive." His voice grew louder, rawer, shaking with rage. "No food, no water, no comms, no reinforcements. They're not coming for us. They never were." Leena's hands tightened on her rifle. Mason's eyes darted to her. "Say something for once, don't just sit there." The words struck harder than bullets. Because she wanted to. God, she wanted to. But silence had been her weapon, her survival, her curse. Her lips parted, but the sound stuck in her throat. Mason barked a bitter laugh. "Exactly. Nothing, always nothing. You just sit and watch us rot, same as before." Leena's pulse quickened. Same as before. He didn't know what those words meant, not really, but they hit too close. She closed her eyes, fighting the weight pressing on her chest. Not yet, she couldn't tell them yet. That night Leena watched the stars, cold, sharp, indifferent. Her memories rose again, uninvited. The outpost, the ambush, the screams. She remembered Sergeant Kessler, his voice cracking as he called her name, begging her to fire, to move, to do something. But she had stayed down, silent, hidden, her body shaking, her hands covering her mouth as if holding in breath could erase the world outside. When silence fell again, only she remained. She lived. And they died. Her silence had saved her body, but buried her soul. And now in this valley, history was repeating. Mason's voice cut into the dark. "Do you ever think about it?" Leena turned. He sat a few feet away, staring at nothing, his voice low, almost calm. "Back home, what we left behind." Leena swallowed hard. The question was too human, too tender after all this. Mason chuckled bitterly. "I had a daughter. Did I ever tell you that?" Leena blinked. No, he hadn't. "She's 7 now, maybe 8, lost count." His voice cracked, a jagged edge of pain breaking through the anger. "I promised her I'd come back, that I'd teach her how to ride a bike without training wheels. Stupid, right? That's what I thought about before this mission." Her laugh. The way she used to grip the handlebars too tight, like the world was trying to steal them from her. His eyes turned to Leena. "And now she'll remember me as a ghost, another broken promise." Leena's throat ached. Words pushed against her silence. She wanted to tell him he wasn't a ghost yet, that promises still mattered, even in valleys like this. But her voice didn't come. It never did. Mason shook his head. "Figures, I spill my guts and you give me nothing." He turned away, his shoulders shaking in the dark. Leena closed her eyes, her chest burning with shame. Because she had words. She just never gave them. By dawn, the colonel's strength was gone. He tried to sit up, but his body refused. His lips moved, but no sound came. Leena crawled to his side, lifting his head gently, pouring the last drops of water across his lips. He coughed weakly, his hand trembling as it grasped her wrist. His eyes locked on hers, hollow, pleading. "Promise me." His voice was barely a whisper, air more than sound. "Promise me someone makes it out." Leena's chest tightened. She wanted to answer, to give him the dignity of words in his last moments. But silence choked her again. So she only nodded. His hand fell limp. His eyes closed. And the colonel slipped quietly into the silence. Mason stared at his body, jaw clenched, fury simmering. "Two," he muttered. "That's it, just two." His eyes lifted, finding Leena again. "You and me." The words felt like a threat. They sat together in silence as the day crawled past. Mason polished his rifle with hands that shook. Leena stayed still, her eyes burning into the ridges. She thought about the colonel's last words. "Promise me someone makes it out." That promise wasn't just his, it was hers. It had always been hers, buried in silence. The valley wanted to claim them, but maybe not this time. Not her. That evening, Mason's patience finally broke. "I'm leaving." Leena turned. Mason stood, slinging his rifle across his back, his eyes wild, teeth gritted. "I'm not dying here, not waiting, not rotting." He pointed toward the pass where shadows gathered like teeth. "They're out there, sure, but I'd rather face bullets than this." Leena rose slowly. Her voice fought against her throat. "Mason." The word scraped out, raw, barely audible, but it was enough to stop him cold. He turned, shock flickering in his eyes. "You spoke." Leena's heart pounded. The silence shattered in her chest, her voice trembling as it clawed its way out. "I know what happens if you go." Her words cracked, broken, but they were there. Mason's face twisted. "And what? You'll stop me with your silence." "No," her voice steadied, thin but firm, "with the truth." Mason froze. Leena's breath shook as she forced the words out. "I've seen this before. Another mission, another valley. My whole unit died because I stayed quiet, because I thought silence meant survival, and I lived alone." Her eyes burned. "I can't let it happen again, not to you." The air between them went still. Mason stared at her, his rage faltering, confusion breaking through. "You," he swallowed hard, "you've carried that this whole time." Leena nodded, tears stinging her eyes. Silence followed, but this time it wasn't absence, it was weight, understanding. Mason's jaw tightened, his eyes dropped. And for the first time, his fury cracked into something else. Grief. They didn't move that night. Not because Mason had given up on leaving, but because Leena's words had rooted him, forced him to sit with the silence instead of running from it. For the first time, he wasn't fighting her. He was listening. And in that fragile stillness, a sliver of something returned. Not hope, but maybe the shadow of it. Why did she keep glancing at the photograph tucked inside her vest, as though it might vanish if she blinked? The others didn't notice, or maybe they pretended not to. In the haze of exhaustion and tension, small rituals became private shields. That photograph was hers, a fragment of another life, and she feared losing it more than she feared the rifle aimed at her from the hills. The convoy crawled through dust like a wounded beast. Engines coughed. Tires slipped on gravel. Every turn of the mountain road felt too exposed, too fragile. She leaned against the window, eyes locked on the jagged horizon, listening. Silence. Too much silence. Her gut told her something waited beyond that silence. A younger soldier 2 seats down tried humming softly, a song from home. His voice cracked halfway and he gave up, embarrassed. She turned to him, offering a faint smile, just enough to remind him he wasn't invisible, but she didn't speak. She hadn't spoken since dawn, not because she had nothing to say, because silence had become her language. She remembered a training officer once telling her, "Words give away nerves, silence conceals them." She had carried that lesson far beyond the training field. Silence gave her power. It unsettled her enemies. It comforted her allies. But sometimes it trapped her too, because in silence memories echoed louder. The convoy jolted. A sound cut through, the snap of metal, a stifled curse. The lead vehicle ground to a halt. Radios crackled. Orders barked in clipped tones. She lifted her rifle, breath steady, pulse sharp. Dust drifted around them, veiling shapes in the distance. Then stillness. "Why are we stopped?" someone whispered. She didn't answer. Instead, she scanned the ridgeline, that instinct again. A tremor in the air, shadows that weren't just shadows. She raised her hand, two fingers tapping her temple, signaling the sniper's watch. They understood. Tension coiled across the line of soldiers. For 5 long minutes, nothing happened. Just the creak of metal, the restless cough of an engine left idling, the beating sun burning overhead. Then, like a breath released too late, the attack began. Gunfire rattled the canyon walls. Echoes multiplied, disorienting. The younger soldier beside her ducked low, panic widening his eyes. She pulled him closer, pressing his helmet down. "Stay." One word, just one. Her voice startled him, startled even herself. But it anchored him. She slid out, low and swift. The air was thick with dust and sparks. Bullets tore through mirrors, splintered glass. She didn't flinch. Her world narrowed to breath, heartbeat, and sightlines. One figure revealed himself on the ridge. She exhaled slowly, rifle against her shoulder, finger brushing the trigger. A single shot cracked the silence, hers. The figure collapsed, and the echoes rolled away like thunder. The firefight dragged. Minutes stretched into hours in their minds. They gained ground, lost it, then clawed it back. The convoy was battered but intact. When the final shot faded, only silence remained again, different this time. Heavy, spent. The men and women around her sank to the dirt, some shaking, some silent. She stood apart, her chest heaving under the weight of sweat and smoke. She reached into her vest, fingers brushing that photograph again. She didn't look at it. Not yet. She only needed to feel it was still there. One of the sergeants limped toward her, face smeared with grime. He stopped, studying her quietly. "You saved us back there, but why don't you ever talk?" Her eyes flickered toward him, then away. She wanted to answer, wanted to tell him that silence was her shield, her memory, her grief all rolled into one. That if she spoke too much, her voice might betray how badly she missed someone she could never get back. But instead, she gave the faintest nod and turned away. Silence spoke for her. That night, as they set up a makeshift camp, the younger soldier from the convoy approached. He carried 2 tin cups of lukewarm coffee. He handed her one without a word. She accepted it. Their eyes met, just for a heartbeat, and in that glance a conversation passed between them. "You're scared." "Yes." "Me too. But we're here, still here." Later, lying beneath a blanket of cold stars, she finally allowed herself to unfold the photograph. The face looking back at her, smiling, alive, unbroken, felt like a wound and a cure all at once. She touched the edge gently, whispering into the night, though no one was near enough to hear. "Not absence, never absence." The mountain wind carried her words away, or maybe it carried them home. And in that silence, she closed her eyes, ready for whatever the next dawn demanded. Why did the dawn feel heavier than the night? The mountains glowed faintly in the first light, painted in cold blue and gray, but no one celebrated the survival of another day. They moved in silence, shoulders bent, eyes scanning the ridges. Something lingered, unfinished. She knew it, felt it. The mission had not ended yesterday with the firefight. That had only been the test. The true reason they were here, what she carried in her orders and in her chest, still waited ahead. The convoy was smaller now. One truck abandoned, a soldier evacuated with wounds too severe to ignore. The rest marched, boots crunching on gravel, rifles slung heavy. They spoke in short bursts, logistics, coordinates, nothing more. Every word was a weight. She walked at the edge of the column, her rifle against her chest, her breath steady. Yet her silence was different today. Not only protective, not only survival, it was purpose. Inside her vest, the photograph pressed close to her heartbeat. It wasn't just memory, it was the reason. They didn't know yet, she hadn't told them, but she would, soon. The path narrowed into a gorge, high cliffs on both sides, perfect for an ambush. Everyone felt it. Fingers tightened on triggers. A bird screeched somewhere above, wings slicing the pale sky. Halfway through, the sergeant raised his hand. Halt! Something glimmered ahead. Wires, improvised deadly. The squad froze. Tension spiked. She stepped forward slowly. Kneeling, she studied the pattern, her hands calm. It was precise, cruel. Whoever said it knew soldiers would pass here. She exhaled, then carefully cut a line, pressed her palm against the dirt, feeling for vibration. None. Still, she hesitated. Why this trap here now? Then it hit her, it wasn't designed to kill them. It was designed to slow them, to buy time. Her pulse quickened. She looked up at the sergeant. "They're ahead," she whispered. Her voice cracked the silence like thunder. It startled the others. Many had never heard her speak. For a beat, no one moved. Then the sergeant nodded grimly. "Move fast." The gorge spilled into a valley, barren and vast. And there, beyond the skeletal trees, past the shimmer of heat, stood the structure. Half-buried, scarred by war, but unmistakable. The compound. The younger soldier's breath caught. This is it. She didn't answer. Her eyes fixed on it with a gravity that silenced everyone else. They felt her resolve before she said anything. They knew now, she carried something more than orders. As they drew closer, resistance found them. Gunfire burst from the compound's ruins, sharp and chaotic. The squad dove for cover, returning fire. Dust erupted, fragments flew. She didn't flinch. She pushed forward, movements measured, eyes locked on the building. With each shot, each step, a piece of her past surged back. Laughter in a sunlit kitchen, the weight of a hand in hers, a voice saying, "Come back safe." She pressed harder for them, for what was lost, for what silence had guarded all this time. Inside the compound, the air was suffocating, stone walls cracked, smoke curling through. Shadows moved fast. It was close quarters now. Faces flashed, eyes wide, decisions made in seconds. The sergeant took a hit to his arm, grunting but pushing on. Another soldier dragged him back, covering his flank. The younger one, trembling but determined, followed her lead, his trust absolute. At the heart of the compound, behind a reinforced door, they found it. Not weapons, not treasure, documents, maps, evidence of something planned, something that would have reached beyond these mountains into homes far away. She froze, not because of the intel itself, but because of a name scrawled on one page. The same name as the man in her photograph, her husband. He had been here, not as enemy, not as soldier, as prisoner, and he hadn't survived. Her breath caught, sharp and silent, the truth pressed down like stone. She closed her eyes, steadying. The squad around her didn't ask. They didn't need to. The way she touched the paper, the way her shoulders trembled then hardened, it told them enough. They gathered what they came for. The mission on paper was complete, but for her it was only now beginning to end. Outside, the valley was eerily still. Smoke thinned into the rising sun. Birds circled overhead. One by one, the squad emerged, carrying scars they couldn't yet feel. She stood apart again, the photograph in one hand, the folder in the other. Wind tugged at her hair. Dust stung her eyes, but she didn't weep. She didn't break. She simply breathed, long, slow, resolute. The younger soldier approached quietly. "Ma'am, are you okay?" She didn't answer right away. She looked at him, at all of them, their tired faces, their silent endurance. And for the first time, she spoke more than a single word. "Silence isn't absence," she said softly. "It's courage, the kind you carry when words aren't enough." They listened, unmoving, the weight of her truth sinking deep. She folded the photograph carefully, placing it back against her heart. Then she shouldered her rifle, turned toward the horizon, and started walking. No orders, no speeches, just movement. The others followed, not because they had to, because they wanted to. The mission had taken much. It had given something too, a reminder, a bond, a lesson they would never forget. By the time the sun fully rose, they were silhouettes against the light, figures defined not by noise, but by quiet resilience. And when history forgot the details, when even names faded, what would remain was this. Sometimes dignity doesn't speak. It simply acts. The silence she carried became their courage too. And in that silence they walked on,